Welcome to World Explain. In the late 19th century, London was the undisputed capital of the world. It was this sprawling, industrial behemoth of immense wealth and global power. But just east of the glittering city center lay Whitechapel. It was a labyrinthine slum of crushing poverty, suffocating smog, and basically, forgotten souls. Now, in the autumn of 1888, a heavy shadow fell over these cobbled streets, and honestly, it's one that would never truly lift. Destitute women were being hunted by a phantom, a vicious entity who managed to paralyze a city of millions, send absolute shockwaves across the globe, and then just vanish into the ether. We are looking at the darkest mystery in the entire annals of true crime.
To really understand the sheer, breathless panic that gripped the city, we have to start right at the beginning. The crimes were considered almost beyond belief in their brutality. Take the morning of August 7th, for example. Martha Tabram was discovered on a first-floor landing in the George Yard buildings. She had been stabbed an astonishing 39 times. But you know what the true terror of this moment was? George Yard was a severely overcrowded residential complex. You had dozens of tenants sleeping mere feet away, separated by nothing but thin wooden walls. And yet, amidst all this dense humanity, not a single soul heard a scream or a disturbance. The killer struck with a silent, ferocious brutality that is just deeply chilling.
Martha Tabram marked the horrifying dawn of what was about to become an escalating nightmare. Within just weeks, the terror condensed into what historians now call the canonical five. 5 destitute women who were systematically butchered by the exact same deranged hand. On August 31st, Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in the bleak, gaslit stretch of Bucks Row. And the horror had evolved. Her throat was severed with terrifying force. And the really crazy part? The medical examiner estimated she had been dead for less than half an hour, meaning the killer had just slipped away into the thick autumn fog, mere moments before her body was found.
So the police were essentially facing an impossible phantom. Think about it. No weapon was ever recovered, no blood trail led away from the bodies, and there were absolutely no witnesses. Inspector Joseph Helson, who was the lead investigator on the Nichols case, was forced to admit a haunting realization to an already terrified public. He had to say that not an atom of evidence could be obtained to connect any living person with this crime.
By September 8th, the violence reached an absolute fever pitch. Annie Chapman was discovered in the muddy backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. This wasn't just a frenzied attack anymore. It had become terrifyingly methodical. The killer possessed the chilling anatomical precision required to navigate the dark and surgically extract her womb. Yet, amidst all this chaotic butchery, he displayed a deeply disturbing calm. He actually took the time to forcefully remove 2 brass rings as trophies and then neatly, deliberately arranged her small pocket possessions right at her feet. And once again, as the dim light of dawn crept in, this monster just walked away completely unseen.
The press, as you might imagine, was mercilessly criticizing the police. They captured the futility of the investigation with a haunting metaphor. Finding this killer was literally like finding a single grain of sand in a sprawling desert. You see, the slums of the East End housed tens of thousands of transient workers, sailors, and immigrants, all packed into a maze of unmapped alleys. So the public was in a state of absolute breathless panic, demanding answers from a severely under-resourced police force that was, for all intents and purposes, hunting a ghost.
Which brings us to our next section, a city paralyzed, detailing the infamous night of September 30th.
That specific night would cement the killer's legacy forever. Here's how it played out. At exactly 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard, Elizabeth Stride is discovered. Her throat is cut, but crucially, there are no other mutilations. Now, a witness named Israel Schwartz likely saw the attack happen. He heard a man shout the anti-Semitic slur Lipski before Schwartz himself fled in terror. Because Stride lacked the killer's signature mutilations, investigators strongly believe he was interrupted, maybe by the clatter of a pony cart entering the yard. So frustrated and with his bloodlust unsated, he melts into the darkness. But just 45 minutes later and less than a kilometer away in Mitre Square, he strikes again. Catherine Eddowes was subjected to the most ferocious attack yet, her face deeply cut and a kidney expertly extracted. And the most chilling detail of all, a police officer had walked that exact square just 15 minutes prior. The killer was literally operating in the razor-thin margins of police patrols.
But this time, he made a mistake. A blood-stained piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found discarded near a doorway a few blocks away. And right above it, scrawled in chalk, was a grammatically bizarre message. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." So was it written by the killer's own blood-soaked hand? Was it a calculated attempt to cast blame on the heavily persecuted local Jewish community? Fearing immediate violent race riots in the East End, the police actually ordered the message washed away before dawn. In doing so, they destroyed potentially the only direct communication from the killer, leaving its true meaning fiercely debated to this very day.
Let's dive into the next phase, taunts and trophies, a terrifying era of psychological warfare.
As if the physical brutality wasn't horrifying enough, a dark campaign of psychological warfare suddenly began. A postcard addressed to the "Dear Boss" of the Central News Agency was the first to use the chilling signature that would echo through history, Jack the Ripper. It boldly promised to clip the next victim's ears off, a horrifying promise that was kept when Edoes was found with a severed earlobe. But the true terror arrived in a small cardboard box sent to George Lusk, the chairman of the local vigilance committee. Inside this box was half of a human kidney. The enclosed letter, simply titled "From Hell," claimed the author had fried and eaten the other half. Now, while the public was absolutely paralyzed with fear, high-ranking police officials like Robert Anderson remained deeply cynical. They suspected this was nothing more than an enterprising, macabre hoax spun by some sensationalist journalist desperate to sell newspapers.
Following the nightmare of the double event, a suffocating silence fell over Whitechapel. All of October passed without a single incident. The terrified locals began to whisper, maybe the nightmare was finally over. But then came the frigid morning of November 9th, 13 Miller's Court. For the very first time, the phantom didn't strike in a muddy yard or a dark, damp alley. For the first time, he struck indoors, behind a locked door.
The victim was Mary Jane Kelly. At 25, she was the youngest of the canonical five. When her landlord's assistant peered through a broken window pane to collect rent, he was met with a scene that completely defied human comprehension. A veteran investigator noted the room looked more like the work of a devil than a man. Kelly had been systematically dismantled, her remains dispersed entirely around the small room. We know she had been desperate for money that night, and was last seen jovially talking to a well-dressed man who handed her a red handkerchief. At 4 a.m., faint cries of murder were heard through the thin walls, but in the brutal, violent reality of the East End, neighbors simply ignored them.
And then, absolute silence. Mary Jane Kelly is widely regarded as the final canonical victim. The murders simply stopped. It remains one of the most haunting questions in all of criminal history. Why? Did the Ripper succumb to a fatal illness? Did he take his own life in a fit of manic guilt? Was he quietly locked away in an asylum somewhere for an unrelated crime? Or did he board a ship and flee across the ocean? He vanished completely into the fog, leaving Victorian police adrift in a labyrinth of their own making. So let's get into the deep analysis, the prime suspects, and how investigators tried narrowing the search.
Desperate for any kind of breakthrough, investigators turned to a revolutionary, though highly primitive, form of criminal profiling. Dr. Thomas Bond painstakingly analyzed the mutilations and witness reports, basically attempting to peer directly into the mind of the phantom. He hypothesized the killer was a strong, middle-aged, respectably dressed man who looked entirely inoffensive, a monster hiding perfectly behind a mask of normalcy. Yet interestingly, Bond fiercely debated his own colleagues, insisting the killer possessed absolutely no scientific or anatomical knowledge, which directly contradicted the doctors who had examined Chapman and Edoes. The police were completely paralyzed by contradictory witness accounts. One person saw a clerk, another swore they saw a sailor. The horrifying truth? None of them may have ever actually laid eyes on the real killer.
Modern researchers often look not at shadowy strangers, but at those who might have been hiding in plain sight. Take Charles Lechmere, for instance. He was the man who actually found the body of the very first victim, Marianne Nichols. Yet when questioned, he gave police a fake name, Charles Cross. Even more chillingly, his daily morning commute precisely mapped onto the times and locations of the murders. Then there is Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's ex-lover. He had lived in that exact room at Miller's Court until just days before her death. He was known to be furious about her return to prostitution. Furthermore, Barnett knew the exact specific trick to reach through the broken window to lock the door from the inside, a lock that was found engaged after Kelly's murder. So you have to ask yourself, was this the work of a random phantom or a heartbroken man exacting a terrifying, deeply intimate revenge?
The highest-ranking police officials back then, however, had their own definitive targets. They heavily championed a local Polish Jewish resident named Aaron Kosminski. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson vehemently claimed the Ripper had been definitively identified by a silent, unnamed witness, and that Kosminski was a homicidal maniac who was now, as he put it, safely caged in an asylum.
But modern analysis totally shatters this confident Victorian narrative. Kosminski did indeed suffer from profound auditory hallucinations, but deep dives into his asylum medical records reveal a man who was largely apathetic, quiet, and entirely harmless. He hardly fits the profile of a criminal mastermind capable of surgically evading the entire Metropolitan Police Force night after night.
The desire to definitively close this case often leads to sensationalized modern media frenzies. You might remember that in 2011, headlines exploded worldwide claiming a DNA test on a blood-stained shawl, supposedly stolen from the Catherine Etowah's crime scene, definitively matched Aaron Kosminski. But impartially examining the genetics reveals some glaring flaws. First off, there is absolutely zero historical documentation proving this expensive silk shawl was ever actually present at the bloody crime scene. Second, the test relied on mitochondrial DNA. Now, unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA is passed down identically through the female line, meaning it is shared by literally hundreds of thousands of people of similar descent. It can exclude a suspect, sure, but it absolutely cannot convict one. The media's solved case was unfortunately nothing more than scientific smoke and mirrors.
And the sprawling encyclopedias of suspects only get stranger from there. Enter Francis Tumblety, an eccentric, flamboyantly dressed American quack who aggressively marketed himself as the Indian herb doctor. Tumblety coincidentally happened to be operating in London during the exact autumn of 1888. Following an arrest for gross indecency just days before Mary Jane Kelly's murder, Tumblety skipped bail, fled across the English Channel, and immediately boarded a ship back to the United States, drawing massive suspicion from Scotland Yard.
On paper, he seems like the ultimate Hollywood villain, right? Rumors swirled across the Atlantic that Tumblety hosted bizarre all-male dinner parties where he proudly showcased a terrifying collection of preserved human wombs in glass jars. But peeling back the historical layers reveals a completely different story. The womb collection narrative was entirely spun by an American journalist named Charles Dunham, a man thoroughly documented by historians as a lifelong con artist and a pathological liar. Furthermore, Tumblety was physically colossal, sporting an enormous mustache and flamboyant militaristic outfits. It really strains all logic to imagine a giant, pompous American aristocrat sneaking through the cramped, muddy, highly insular alleys of Whitechapel completely undetected by the locals.
Which brings us to our final reflections on an enduring enigma, a ghost in the metropolis.
Over a century later, the shadows of Whitechapel remain completely untouched by the light of justice. Over the decades, desperate theorists have pointed fingers at famous Victorian painters, high-ranking aristocratic doctors, and even members of the British royal family. But honestly, these grand, elaborate conspiracies feel hopelessly contrived. They entirely miss the grim, terrifying reality of the East End. London was the largest port city in the known world, a massive, transient hub overflowing with poorly documented drifters. The killer didn't need a royal carriage or a fancy surgeon's degree. The truth is likely far simpler, and to be honest, far more chilling. He could have easily been a lowly sailor stepping off a cargo ship for the weekend, an unassuming butcher walking home, or a quiet delivery clerk. Just a man who committed unspeakable horrors in the dead of night, only to wash his hands, button his coat, and perfectly blend back into the labyrinth of the slums, exactly like a single grain of sand.
He is the ultimate enigma, a phantom born of poverty and fog. And as we look back through the centuries, staring into the mist of the metropolis, we are left wondering what face truly hid beneath the brim of that dark hat. Who was Jack the Ripper? Thank you for watching World Explain. See you in the next video.